You have been warned about vitamin D your entire adult life. Magazines told you to be careful. Doctors cautioned you against taking too much. The internet filled with dire articles about toxicity, kidney damage, dangerously high calcium levels, a cascade of harms supposedly lurking behind every supplement bottle. You learned to fear this substance the way you might fear a medication with serious side effects, something to approach with caution and consume only under strict supervision. The messaging was consistent and pervasive. Too much vitamin D is dangerous. Watch your levels. Do not exceed the recommended dose. The upper limit exists for a reason. You absorbed these warnings without questioning their origin, without examining whether the fear was proportionate to the actual risk, without asking the question that might unravel everything. What about too little? Because while you were being warned about the dangers of excess, while the entire medical conversation revolved around upper limits and toxicity thresholds, something else was happening that received far less attention. Billions of people around the world, perhaps including you, were living in a state of chronic deficiency. Their vitamin D levels remained low month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And the consequences of this deficiency, the slow accumulation of dysfunction across multiple body systems, went largely unmentioned while the rare spectre of toxicity dominated the narrative. What if the fear was manufactured? What if the attention was directed toward the wrong end of the spectrum? What if the truth about vitamin D has been obscured not by accident, but by forces that benefit from your uncertainty and your deficiency? This is what I want to explore, not to tell you that vitamin D toxicity is impossible, because it is not, but to reframe the question entirely, to examine whether the emphasis on toxicity has distracted from the far more prevalent problem of deficiency, to reveal what vitamin D actually is, how it works in your body, why the conventional understanding is incomplete, and what happens when you finally give your body what it has been missing. Let me begin with something fundamental that changes how you should think about this substance. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin. This is not semantic wordplay. It reflects a genuine misclassification that distorts how people understand its role. Vitamins, by definition, are essential compounds that the body cannot produce and must obtain from food. Vitamin C must come from diet because humans lost the ability to synthesize it. B vitamins must come from diet because we cannot manufacture them internally. This is what makes them vitamins. They require external intake through nutrition. Vitamin D does not fit this definition. Your body is fully capable of producing vitamin D, and it does so through a remarkable process that requires no food at all. When ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight reaches your skin, it interacts with a cholesterol compound present in your skin cells. This interaction transforms the cholesterol into a vitamin D precursor, which then travels to your liver and kidneys for activation into its functional form. You manufacture it yourself from your own cholesterol, using nothing but sunlight as the trigger. Food sources of vitamin D exist, but they are remarkably poor compared to what your skin can produce. A serving of salmon might provide a few hundred international units. A few minutes of summer sun exposure can produce 10,000 units or more. The disparity is enormous. Trying to obtain adequate vitamin D from food alone is like trying to fill a swimming pool with a teaspoon. It was never meant to be the primary source. If vitamin D behaves like something the body produces internally from cholesterol, if it circulates through the bloodstream and activates receptors throughout the body, if it regulates gene expression and influences cellular function across multiple organ systems, then what is it really? The answer is that vitamin D functions as a hormone. It belongs in the same category as testosterone, estrogen, cortisol, thyroid hormones, the signaling molecules that coordinate activity across your entire physiology. This reclassification has profound implications. Hormones are not optional supplements. They are essential regulators without which systems fail. When you understand that vitamin D is hormonal, you understand that deficiency is not merely suboptimal. It is a state of hormonal insufficiency, with all the dysfunction that implies. The scope of vitamin D's influence extends far beyond what most people have been taught. Conventional understanding focuses on bones. Vitamin D helps absorb calcium. Calcium builds bones. Therefore, vitamin D is important for skeletal health. This is true, but radically incomplete. It is like saying the sun is important for your mood. True, but missing the fact that the sun provides the energy that drives all life on Earth. Vitamin D receptors exist in virtually every tissue of your body. Your immune cells have them. Your brain cells have them. Your muscle cells have them. Your breast, colon, and prostate tissues have them. Your pancreas has them. Your heart has them. Over 1,000 genes are influenced by vitamin D signaling. When vitamin D binds to its receptors in cells throughout your body, it changes which genes are expressed and which are silenced. It is a master regulator operating across your entire physiology, not a minor player in calcium metabolism. To understand why deficiency is so consequential, and why adequate levels require more than conventional recommendations suggest, you need to understand that your body actually operates two distinct vitamin D systems. This dual system is rarely explained in standard medical education, but it changes everything about how you should think about dosing and sufficiency. The first system is the classical endocrine system. This is the one you've heard about. Vitamin D from sun exposure or supplements travels to the liver, where it is converted to a storage form called calcidiol, or 25-hydroxyvitamin D. This is what blood tests measure when they check your vitamin D status. From storage, vitamin D is activated by the kidneys into its potent hormonal form, calcitriol, or 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. This activated form circulates through the bloodstream and maintains calcium balance, supporting bone health. This classical system is efficient at low doses because its primary function, calcium regulation, does not require enormous amounts of vitamin D. The kidneys tightly control activation to maintain calcium homeostasis. A few hundred units daily may be sufficient to prevent rickets and maintain basic bone metabolism. This is the system that conventional recommendations are based on. This is why official guidance suggests relatively small amounts. The skeletal system can be served with modest intake, but the second system operates differently. This is the autocrine and paracrine system, and it represents the broader hormonal functions of vitamin D that most medical practice overlooks. In this system, activation does not occur in the kidneys. It occurs locally, inside individual cells throughout the body. Immune cells can convert stored vitamin D into the active form right where they need it. Brain cells can do the same. Muscle cells can do the same. This local activation serves functions unrelated to calcium, immune regulation, cell growth control, inflammation modulation, neurological protection, and much more. The autocrine system has a critical difference from the endocrine system. The active vitamin D it produces has a short half-life, roughly 24 hours. It is made, used, and cleared quickly. To maintain adequate local activation across the many tissues that depend on this system, you need consistent daily vitamin D availability at levels much higher than what the skeletal system alone requires. This is why someone can have vitamin D levels that are technically sufficient to prevent rickets, while still being functionally deficient for immune function, cognitive protection, and cancer prevention. The endocrine system is satisfied. The autocrine system is starving. The blood test looks adequate. The cells throughout the body are not receiving what they need. The disconnect between these two systems explains a puzzle that has confused researchers and clinicians. Studies that examine vitamin D and health outcomes sometimes produce disappointing results. Supplementation at conventional doses does not always reduce disease risk as expected. Critics point to these studies and conclude that vitamin D is overhyped. But the studies typically use doses appropriate for the endocrine system, while ignoring the higher requirements of the autocrine system. They fail to provide what the broader hormonal functions actually need. Now let me address why the conversation about vitamin D remains so narrowly focused on bones, and why the broader functions receive less attention. The answer involves both institutional inertia and economic incentives that few people examine carefully. Medicine tends to focus on what has been established longest and proven most conclusively. The relationship between vitamin D and bones has been studied for a century. It is textbook material, uncontroversial, accepted. The newer research on immune function, cancer prevention, autoimmune modulation, and neurological health is more recent, sometimes conflicting, still being debated. Institutions move slowly, curricula update slowly. Practicing physicians learned what was known when they trained and may not have incorporated newer understandings. But there is another factor that deserves consideration. Vitamin D is not patentable. It is a naturally occurring compound that anyone can manufacture and sell. No pharmaceutical company owns exclusive rights to it. No corporation can charge premium prices for it. A year's supply costs a few dollars. It requires no prescription. It generates no ongoing revenue stream tied to clinic visits and monitoring. Now consider what vitamin D deficiency might be doing to the markets for patentable pharmaceuticals. If adequate vitamin D status reduced autoimmune disease incidence, how would that affect the multi-billion-dollar market for immune-suppressing drugs? If vitamin D reduced cancer risk, what would happen to the markets for chemotherapy agents and targeted oncology therapeutics? If vitamin D improved mood and cognitive function, how would that impact antidepressant and Alzheimer's medication sales? If vitamin D enhanced metabolic health, what would happen to diabetes drug revenues? I'm not suggesting a coordinated conspiracy. I'm noting that incentive structures do not align. There is no corporate entity motivated to fund large-scale vitamin D research and promote its findings. There is no pharmaceutical sales force educating physicians about vitamin D's broader benefits. There are no continuing medical education programs sponsored by vitamin D manufacturers because vitamin D manufacturers are selling a commodity that costs pennies per dose. Meanwhile, the companies selling branded pharmaceuticals for conditions that vitamin D might help prevent have every reason not to encourage exploration of this alternative. Research that challenges dominant paradigms often faces obstacles. Scientists who have spent careers studying vitamin D describe difficulty getting positive findings published in major journals. Review processes seem to favor skepticism about vitamin D benefits, while accepting claims of risk more readily. This may not be deliberate suppression in any sinister sense. It may simply be the natural conservatism of institutions protecting established knowledge from challenges. But the effect is the same. Information about vitamin D's broader benefits disseminates slowly while warnings about toxicity circulate freely. Consider what has actually been demonstrated in research. A large randomized controlled trial from Harvard followed thousands of participants over several years, examining whether vitamin D supplementation affected autoimmune disease incidence. The results showed meaningful reductions in autoimmune conditions among those taking vitamin D compared to placebo. This was not observational data subject to confounding. This was a randomized trial, the gold standard of evidence. Vitamin D supplementation reduced autoimmune disease. Think about what that means. Autoimmune diseases, conditions where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, are typically treated with powerful immune-suppressing medications that have significant side effects and generate enormous pharmaceutical revenues. Rheumatoid arthritis drugs, multiple sclerosis drugs, inflammatory bowel disease drugs, lupus drugs, psoriasis drugs. These are major profit centers for pharmaceutical companies. A cheap, unpatentable supplement that reduces the incidence of these conditions threatens those revenue streams. The research exists, the evidence accumulates, but the translation into standard medical practice proceeds slowly when no commercial entity benefits from accelerating it. Let me return to the question of sun exposure, because this is where the modern narrative becomes most disconnected from evolutionary reality. Humans evolved in equatorial Africa under intense, constant sunlight. Our ancestors spent their days outdoors, exposed to ultraviolet radiation that their skin converted into vitamin D continuously. This was not optional or occasional. This was the universal human condition for hundreds of thousands of years. Every system in your body developed with the assumption that vitamin D would be abundantly available because the sun was always present. The idea that sun exposure is dangerous and should be minimized is historically unprecedented. No previous human population systematically avoided sunlight. The anti-sun messaging that dominates modern public health represents an extreme departure from how humans have always lived. It may have merit for certain populations in certain contexts, but it cannot be assumed to be universally correct when it contradicts the entire evolutionary history of our species. Consider the implications. If 20 minutes of summer sun exposure can generate around 10,000 international units of vitamin D, and if humans evolved under conditions where such exposure occurred daily, then our bodies are adapted to vitamin D levels that dwarf what modern recommendations suggest. The official recommended daily allowance of 600 to 800 units represents a tiny fraction of what natural sun exposure produces. The suggestion that supplementing with a few thousand units is risky, while natural exposure produces much more, seems inconsistent, unless you believe that humans evolved with a toxicity risk built into their relationship with the sun. Some will point to skin cancer as justification for sun avoidance. The relationship between sun exposure and skin cancer is more nuanced than public messaging suggests. Different types of skin cancer have different relationships with sun exposure. The most lethal form, melanoma, has a complicated relationship that does not consistently show more melanoma in those with more sun exposure. Some studies suggest that indoor workers have higher melanoma rates than outdoor workers, despite the outdoor workers receiving far more cumulative sun exposure. Intermittent intense exposure, like vacation sunburns, may be more problematic than regular moderate exposure. The simple equation that more sun equals more cancer is not supported by the full body of evidence. Meanwhile, the association between vitamin D deficiency and cancer is consistently observed. Low vitamin D status is associated with increased risk of breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, and others. The mechanism is plausible. Vitamin D influences cell growth regulation, and insufficient vitamin D may allow abnormal cells to proliferate when they would otherwise be controlled. It is possible that the harm from sun avoidance through vitamin D deficiency exceeds the harm from moderate sun exposure that people have been taught to fear. The modern indoor lifestyle creates what your body interprets as permanent winter. Throughout human evolution, vitamin D levels rose in summer and fell in winter. This seasonal variation was informative. Low vitamin D signaled that winter had arrived, that food might become scarce, that metabolic conservation was appropriate. Your body responds to low vitamin D by slowing metabolism, promoting fat storage, reducing activity, suppressing mood, perhaps even suppressing immunity since fighting infections consumes resources better conserved during scarcity. When you live indoors, wear clothing that covers most of your skin, apply sunscreen that blocks vitamin D synthesis, and rarely experience direct midday sun exposure, your body receives the signal that winter has arrived and is not leaving. Your vitamin D stays low month after month, year after year. Your biology interprets this as a never-ending winter, requiring perpetual conservation mode. The metabolic slowdown, the fat accumulation, the low mood, the susceptibility to infection, these may all be adaptive responses to a signal your body is misinterpreting. You're not evolutionarily designed for the life you are living. You're designed for a life of constant outdoor activity under direct sunlight. Your vitamin D system assumes that light will be abundant. When it is not, systems calibrated for sunshine malfunction in ways that affect every aspect of your health. Now let me address the toxicity that you have been warned about so extensively. Vitamin D toxicity is possible. I am not claiming it is not. But the conditions required to produce toxicity are extreme, far more extreme than the warnings suggest. Toxicity from vitamin D manifests primarily through hypercalcemia, excessively high calcium in the blood. Vitamin D enhances calcium absorption from the gut. If vitamin D levels become extremely elevated over extended periods, calcium absorption can exceed the body's ability to regulate it. The excess calcium causes problems, nausea, kidney stones, confusion, cardiac irregularities. This is genuine toxicity that should be avoided, but the doses required to produce this state are enormous. Case reports of vitamin D toxicity typically involve people taking hundreds of thousands of units daily for extended periods, often due to manufacturing errors that produce supplements with far more vitamin D than labeled. People who take reasonable supplemental doses, even doses well above conventional recommendations, very rarely develop toxicity. The margin of safety is wide. Contrast this with deficiency. Deficiency requires no extreme behavior. It requires merely living indoors, wearing clothes, avoiding sun exposure, and not supplementing. Deficiency is the default state for most modern humans. Toxicity requires active effort to achieve. Yet the messaging focuses on toxicity while normalizing deficiency. The attention is inverted relative to the actual risks most people face. The consequences of deficiency extend across body systems. Immune function suffers when vitamin D is inadequate. The immune system uses vitamin D to activate defensive responses and to regulate itself, preventing both underactivity and overactivity. Deficient people may be more susceptible to infections and more prone to autoimmune dysfunction, where the immune system attacks healthy tissue. Cognitive function appears to depend on adequate vitamin D. Brain cells have vitamin D receptors. Vitamin D influences neurotransmitter synthesis and neuronal protection. Low vitamin D status is associated with cognitive decline and increased dementia risk. The mechanism makes sense given the density of vitamin D receptors in brain tissue. Cancer risk rises with deficiency. The regulatory role of vitamin D in cell growth means that insufficient vitamin D may allow abnormal cells to divide unchecked. The associations between low vitamin D and breast, colon, and prostate cancer are consistent across many studies. This is correlation, and establishing causation requires more evidence, but the biological plausibility is strong. Mood is affected. Vitamin D influences serotonin synthesis. Seasonal affective disorder, the depression that occurs during winter months, correlates with the seasonal drop in vitamin D. Some individuals find that supplementation improves mood in ways that antidepressant medications did not achieve. Metabolic function suffers. Vitamin D influences insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism. Deficiency is associated with increased diabetes risk and greater difficulty maintaining healthy body weight. The seasonal programming I mentioned, the metabolic conservation triggered by low vitamin D, may contribute to the weight gain that many people experience despite their best dietary efforts. Given these widespread consequences, the question that should dominate discussion is not how to avoid toxicity. It is how to avoid the far more common state of deficiency that produces harm across so many domains. Supporting nutrients deserve mention because they affect how vitamin D functions and may explain some of the concerns about supplementation. Vitamin D increases calcium absorption, but calcium must go somewhere useful. Vitamin K2 directs calcium toward bones and teeth, away from soft tissues where calcium deposition causes problems. Magnesium is required for vitamin D metabolism at multiple steps. Without adequate magnesium, vitamin D cannot be properly activated and utilized. Many studies examining vitamin D supplementation do not account for these cofactors. Participants may take vitamin D while remaining deficient in magnesium or K2. The vitamin D cannot function optimally. Problems attributed to vitamin D excess may actually reflect calcium dysregulation caused by insufficient cofactors. If you supplement with vitamin D while ensuring adequate magnesium and K2, the risks of calcium-related complications likely diminish. This is another way the vitamin D conversation has been incomplete. Nutrients do not operate in isolation. Vitamin D needs partners to function properly. Studying vitamin D alone, without attention to the nutritional context in which it operates, produces misleading results that fuel unwarranted concerns. Let me reframe the question that should guide your thinking about vitamin D. Instead of asking how much is too much, ask what is the cost of too little. Instead of focusing on the upper limits that might produce toxicity in extreme cases, consider the lower limits below, which dysfunction accumulates across immune, cognitive, metabolic and skeletal systems. If you're like most people living indoor modern lives, you are not near the toxicity threshold. You're likely well below the levels associated with optimal function. The risk you face is not from excess. It is from chronic insufficiency that you have been conditioned to accept as normal. The fear of vitamin D that has been instilled in you serves certain interests. It does not serve your health. The deficiency that results from this fear has real consequences that you may be experiencing right now: susceptibility to illness, cognitive fog, mood disturbances, metabolic struggles, bone fragility that will manifest as you age. Humans evolved under abundant sunlight. Your body expects vitamin D levels that modern indoor living does not provide. The systems that depend on vitamin D, essentially every system in your body given the distribution of its receptors, are running on empty, while you worry about the remote possibility of excess. The truth about vitamin D is not that it is dangerous. The truth is that its absence is dangerous, and that truth has been suppressed beneath warnings about a risk you are unlikely to face. The bigger threat is the one you have been living with, perhaps for years or decades, the hormonal insufficiency that affects your immunity, your brain, your metabolism, your mood, your cellular function, all because you were taught to fear the substance your body most needs. I have created extensive content examining these issues from multiple angles because they matter profoundly for health outcomes that most people struggle with unnecessarily. The research exists. The mechanisms are understood. The evidence accumulates even as institutional inertia and economic interests slow its translation into practice. What you do with this information is your choice. You can continue accepting deficiency as normal because you have been warned about the dangers of adequacy, or you can reconsider whether the fear you absorbed was ever proportionate to the actual risk. The sun that your species evolved under has not changed. Your need for what it provides has not changed. Only the messaging has changed, steering you away from what you need while protecting markets for products that might become less necessary if you are not deficient. Ask your doctor to test your vitamin D levels. Understand where you fall on the spectrum. Consider whether the levels you are told are adequate actually reflect what your broader vitamin D systems require. Research the evidence yourself, looking past the warnings about toxicity to the far more prevalent problem of insufficiency. The truth about vitamin D is that it is essential, that most people have too little, and that the fear surrounding it has been disproportionate to the actual risks. What they never taught you is what you have been missing while they kept you afraid of having enough.